say a word.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Who likes history? Who likes trains? Who likes trees? You're in the right place. My name is Deborah Schwartz, and I'm on the board of directors for the Mill Valley Historical Society, and I'm in charge of the First Wednesday Speaker Series and the Oral History Program. And welcome to the first presentation of 2020, the Laurel Railroad Tie, Forgotten Last Tie of the First Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. I just would like to say personally that receptions like this, audiences like this, and enthusiasm like this really compel me to try to bring to you wonderful talks, interesting history, help reveal the secrets behind the people we often walk past every day, and to bring together in history and culture the love of our community. So thank you so much for being here this evening. First, as always, we want to thank the Mill Valley Library for allowing the Mill Valley Historical Society to host our speaker series here in this beautiful library. One of the ways that we show our appreciation is at the end of the evening, we have racks, which we put these chairs back up on, and we really appreciate, and in fact, we rely your help with that. And so, I want to say that tonight's program's a little bit different from our regular evening presentations, in that we have more than one speaker. In fact, we have a few speakers. So it was Pat Goggins here, our main speaker, who first contacted me about tonight's topic, and he will begin the presentation. And then former president of the Northern California Film Directors Guild and a former workmate of Pat's from Bancroft Whitney Legal Publishers, John Morse, right there. He's going to be helping Pat with his photos. Next, we'll hear from Norman Ten, right there, who is president of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. And finally, we'll have filmmaker and train historian Fred Runner, who will tell us a little bit about some upcoming events in relation to engine number 9. That's exciting, isn't it? And whatever time we have left, then we'll devote that to Q&A. So really, we actually have a virtual SWAT team of historians here tonight, all dedicated to your historical enrichment. But unfortunately, Lotus Fung was unable to make it tonight, and he will be missed. A law book salesman who retired from Bancroft Whitney Legal Publishers in 1994, Patrick Goggins is better known for his work in Dialogue for Peace in Northern Ireland, which included briefings at the White House during the Clinton administration and travels to Belfast, Dublin, and London. Patrick also worked on bicultural programs in Montana with Blackfeet and Chippewa Cree tribes. He's also acting co-chair of the Irish-Mexican Fiesta in the Mission, a benefit for Central Latina Services for the Elderly. Pat was director of the Irish Forum Dialogue for Peace in Ireland from 1980 to 1998, chair of the Irish Literary and Historical Society, and is a member of the United Irish Cultural Center and Chinese Historical Society of America and the Chinese Railroad Workers' Descendants Association. His work with immigrants on the Mexican-California border is another one of his many involvements, which is really a list too long to go into in this short intro. But suffice it to say that Pat and his wife Uta are good neighbors and dedicated citizens of the world in many ways. A longtime Mill Valley resident, Pat is deeply connected to nature in Mount Tamalpais and is a member of many environmental organizations. An avid bird watcher, and with patience and practice, Pat has trained scrub jays to land on his head, arms, and fingertips. So if there are any infectious disease specialists out there, of course, we have one more special guest tonight, and that is our beautiful California Laurel Bay tree. But I'll leave the introduction of that to Pat. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Pat Goggins, Norman Ten, Fred Runner, John Morris, and of course, the California Laurel Bay tree.
Thank you. Wow. Mount Tam is paramount in our family. When we moved to Mill Valley in 1967, we hit the zigzag trail. We went all the way to Stinson Beach several times, twice in moonlight, with 2 kids on our shoulders. We bonded with our mother mountain. 50 years later, in Utah, I discovered the story of the Laurel Tie from Mount Tamalpais. It wasn't what's called hidden history, but it sure was overshadowed. Welcome to the Laurel Tree family, because they have welcomed us. When you look out those windows over there, you see a wonderful laurel tree arching across and welcoming the redwood trees. And you see another. Oh, thank you. And you see another that's embracing the creek, laying across the creek. So the laurels are surrounding us and welcoming us as we welcome them. You see the photograph there of the laurel leaves from our backyard. The dominant tree in our Deer Haven bird canopy yard in Mill Valley is a bay, Umbellularia californica. The California laurel, it has great particularity with both the huge singular trunk, thin multi-stems, and full evergreen foliage. The roots appeal to raccoon, skunk, and possum. The fragrance is for everybody. Did you catch that one? Uta uses the spicy leaves to spunk soups, stews, and sauces. Some call it the pepperwood tree. In Betty Gerke's book, Chief Marin, she reports the Miwok people ate the laurel nuts, and the leaves served as medicine for headaches and stomach aches. But the Falcon Easy Tree Guide says the common name in the United Kingdom, where the California Bay is occasionally cultivated as an amenity tree, is called the California headache tree. Too much of that aroma. But I don't think that would affect an Irishman. The ancients attributed a sacred distinctiveness to the aromatic laurel of the Mediterranean. For eons, laurel leaves have been used to adorn victors in contests and as a symbol of truce. Every spring, in our house, we stuff a laurel branch of leaves behind the piano so no spiders get in the keys. And it works. And throughout our house, we harvest the branches in the spring and put them in select places, and the insects go elsewhere. So, the laurel tree. How stimulating, what a tree, what charisma. We are lucky that Mount Tam rises in the heart of the California Laurel Coastal Range, from Oregon down to Monterey. And our California laurel also yields a valuable and beautiful wood used in fine cabinet furniture making and extraordinary congratulatory gifts. Thank you, John. In March 1873, hundreds of Chinese workers graded a rail bed from Sausalito to Mill Valley, what would become Sausalito, Mill Valley, and Corte Madera. In the 1880s, Chinese also raised track bed for use in then Sausalito and Mill Valley, Gangs of roving Chinese lived in a tent village 4.5 blocks from where we are right now, east of today's Mill Valley Plaza, working on a rail bed for $1 a day, of course, with Irish foremen overseeing them. On February 5, coincidentally, 1896, some 200, mostly Irish, began construction on the Mill Valley and Mount Tam Scenic Railway at 175 per day. Now that's different than the North Pacific Coast Railroad that I just described coming up from Sausalito. Working on that railroad was kind of tough then, because the railway people docked 1/2 of their pay for their boarding and for their Sunday dinners, and required them to purchase anything from the company store. And the result was that there was a strike. They had a walkout. And when that walkout occurred, the railroad kept moving up the street and putting their rails down right in the streets, in the roads. A gentleman who was an Irishman named John McGinnis, he had already been in trouble with the community because he was selling liquor in his store downtown. But he came with a pistol drawn to the railway workers and said, "You're not going to cut this tree down on the corner of my property for the railway." And he was backed up by no less than Michael Shaughnessy and several other outstanding business community members. So there was a standoff that went all night long. And then the next day, there erupted a further conflict, and on St. Patrick's Day, it flared into almost violence. But the railroad offered to the Irish landowner certain accommodations to purchase his properties, and so he stood down. And the Mount Tam Scenic Railway kept going. But the real significance of this is that this theme of the Irish and the Chinese workers is a broad and fair treatment for all issue, but it's part of our heritage. Both the narrow issue of the Irish-Chinese railroad workers, which is still going on today, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and of course, the fair treatment for all. So the theme of Chinese and Irish railroad workers' relations is a part of our Marin and Mill Valley heritage. Now this photograph here is a photo from a postcard entitled "Mountain Train Leaving Mill Valley for Summit of Mount Tamalpais, California, over the crookedest road in the world." It was sent to folks at home in Dublin, Ireland by the former president of Ireland, Douglas Hyde, in 1906 after he had toured here. And he had taken the train up to the top, and he quoted thereabouts around the world afterwards, "It was the finest panorama I have ever seen." The Mill Valley Mount Tam Railway made us world famous because we can tick off the names of all of the authors and all of the officials and the bohemians who came to ride the train and be a part of it. So this particular picture is still alive because it is featured in a book just published, and the Irish Council had a reception for it over in the city only 2 months ago, a book on his trip in America. And that indicates that the fame of Mount Tam Railway is still with historians, and it's in the books, and we should be proud of it and proud of all of the attention that we give to it, and particularly with people like Fred there and others here in the room. Now, I want to contextualize the situation for the railroad workers back in the day. In 1854-56, after the gold rush waned, 5,700 Chinese left California for home in China. They had made money and they were going back. or they decided to go back because they hadn't made money, because in 1854, that's a few years after the big strike, and things started to cool down. But more than 18,000 new Chinese immigrants came at the same time. They came to the Gold Mountain, as it was advertised and thought of in China as the gold strike and jobs in general. When they came, there were lots of people, but not that many jobs. With diminished jobs, the workers, especially the 4,200 first-generation Irish in San Francisco, pointed to the Chinese as a source of the labor glut. And in 1854, the California Supreme Court Chief Justice Hugh Murray, his decision classified Chinese as black, as contradistinguished from white. Thus, Chinese were denied the right of naturalization, could not vote, hold office, attend school, or testify in court against whites. To Irish people, it's very mindful of the penal colony, the penal laws in Ireland in the same era. As we moved along in our western expansion, there was lobbying for a railroad to be able to bring more settlers and more business to the west. And President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act in 1862 with federal land grants and subsidies to the Union Pacific, which would come from the east, from Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific, which would be built coming from the west to meet with the Union Pacific somewhere, perhaps in Utah. The number one problem was getting labor. The big four capitalists who had formed the main management of the Central Pacific Railroad from the west, Stanford, Huntington, Crocker, and Hopkins, were having trouble keeping the people who had come here, the 49ers, on the railroad, because they'd hear of another little strike and they'd leave. They weren't dependable. So Crocker suggested Chinese. There were quite a few Chinese here, even though they were dubbed as smallish celestials in their dishpan straw hats, and many people looked askance upon hiring them for such hard work. But ground was broken in January 1863, and the Chinese were being hired. The next slide, John, please. The Chinese then were paid less than the whites, and they were given tougher jobs, and they were given the dangerous jobs of dynamite blasting for the tunnels and the mountain sides. Now, this picture is indicative of that. The usual picture you see is one of them hanging in baskets, which they made themselves, and an idea that came from their own culture back home in China. But they were paid less than white for these jobs, and over 1,200 Chinese died in the blasting and the avalanches of snow when they were worked through the winter. In 1865, the chief engineer, Sam Montague of the Central Pacific, wrote, "They are faithful and industrious, soon became skilled and expert in drilling and blasting. Even Stanford, who had denounced Chinese in order to get elected governor, said they are quiet, peaceable, patient, industrious, and economical." Without the Chinese, it would have been impossible to complete the western portion of this great highway. Those are kind of understatements, except the last line, that it would have been impossible without the Chinese. Next picture. Thank you, John. Now, this picture of the Central Pacific track lane, they're through the Sierras, and they're out on the Humboldt Plains in Nevada, going northeast from the Reno Sparks area up towards Winnemucca. You notice the telegraph poles being erected. The telegraph line was erected at the same time as the tracks. The ties are very visible, as you see the ties being laid down, and then some of the rails, and the rails come, of course, on top of the ties. And you see the wooden ties. The wooden ties are the foundation of the railroad. They tie the railroad to the earth. The ties must be hardwood, And the Central Pacific ties were harvested from Northern California redwoods and some cedars and pines. There were many tie contractors providing the 25,800 ties needed for the Central Pacific. And many sawmills were established from Marysville to Truckee. All the rails had to be bought by law from U.S. manufacturers back east. They were shipped around Cape Horn, South America, up to San Francisco, and by schooner and sloop up the Sacramento River to Sacramento, and then by horse, wagon, or sled to the front of the line as it was being built going east. The next picture, please, John. This one is very illustrative of the treatment of the Chinese, the Central Pacific Chinese worker tent encampment next to the rail boxcars for the white construction bosses and engineers. You can even see perhaps a little smoke puffing in the cars up there because they had good quarters for their food and their comfort. The professional labor contractors in San Francisco and Sacramento Chinatowns recruited rural Chinese from the famine-stricken Guangdong province area, Canton, by the Pearl River Delta near Hong Kong. They were fleeing famine and the Taipei Rebellion and the Opium Wars. And so it was not that difficult for these Chinese people to be recruited through the successful merchants in the Chinese community in Sacramento and San Francisco. They were advanced passage money, $40 by steamship to come across the Pacific, $25 to $35 by sailing. Then they were formed into gangs of 10 to 20 each with a headman, an interpreter, the headman was the interpreter, clerk, he clerked, and the cook. The preferred foods were cuttlefish, bamboo shoots, rice, seaweed, and tea, a healthy diet, and the result was little sickness. Compared to the workers on the Union Pacific coming west, taking their water from the same places that the buffalo did, that the Indians did, that every other living creature had done, and not necessarily boiling it and purifying it the way the Chinese so meticulously did. Next picture, please. Yes, thank you. Well, this one is illustrative of something pretty fascinating too, isn't it? Governor Leland Stanford's Central Pacific Special heading east on May 8, 1869 for the May 10 celebration of the completion of the Transcontinental. And it meets the last of the old-time immigrant wagon trains heading west. The driving force of the Transcontinental Railroad was fulfillment of the Manifest Destiny doctrine by ensuring the defense, unity, and expansion of the U.S. empire to California and Oregon territory, thereby advancing settlement, commerce, and the dominant culture. Opening trade with Asia and China in particular was an ultimate objective. Travel from eastern U.S. to the west was reduced from 4 to 6 months to 4 to 6 days. So talk about something earth-shaking. Eureka. Next picture, John. This is a photograph of a gentleman, I think, who deserves much more credit. We hear over and over again the lionizing of Leland Stanford and the Big Four. But this is the man, David Hughes, the genius dreamer, who proposed the idea for the celebration to honor the completion of the work building the Transcontinental Railroad at the final spiking of the tie and rails. David Hughes, a Yalie, came west to San Francisco in 1849, purchased wheelbarrows, hired Chinese laborers at $2 a day when Irish charged $4, to level sand dunes for makeshift dwellings, and then he graded Market Street. He had his own narrow gauge railway running up and down, hauling trainloads of sand. Eventually, he built houses and offices on Market Street and Union Square, and he built the first skyscraper, 15 stories, earning the title Maker of San Francisco. Hughes and wife Bathilda Gray became collectors of art. He was elected to the Oakland City Council. Hughes declared to Leland Stanford, that the completion of the Overland Railway is the greatest event in the history of California since the discovery of gold, I want to contribute as my token of gratitude a last cross tie of California laurel and a last spike of pure mother-lode gold for the ceremony in Utah. Will you accept it? The governor replied, "You bet we will." Next picture, John. The iconic photo here of the gold spike. And they took 35 official pictures, and only one of them had a Chinese person in it. The Chinese had comprised 90% of the workforce. Only one Chinese was in one of the pictures that wasn't even used for publicity. This is the one that went on the front cover of magazines around the world. Celebrating the completion of the railroad May 10th, 1869. There are over 100 people in this picture, no Chinese workers. The immediate and long-term effect of this portrayal was a misrepresentation of history. Before the start of the Golden Spike ceremony, workers brought the laurel wood tie from Stanford's coach, placed it on the grade, and laid the last rail sections across it. The tie and spike donor David Hughes had asked his friend West Evans, a Central Pacific tie contractor who had provided 250,000 ties to the Central Pacific, to have the laurel tie finished and highly polished by a San Francisco billiard table manufacturer, Stroley and Hughes, and affix a silver plaque marked the last tie laid on completion of the Pacific Railroad, May 10th, 1869, projected. There are several entertaining recounts of Governor Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, and Dr. C.P. Durant, vice president of the Union Pacific, swinging the silver-plated maul ineffectively to merely tap the golden spike into pre-drilled holes. There are actually 4 spikes. The first was the gold spike that we all hear about, and that went to the Central Pacific president, Governor Leland Stanford. The second was a gold spike also, and that was presented to the Union Pacific Vice President Dr. T.C. Durant. The third, a silver, was presented to F.A. Tittle, soon to be the Nevada governor. And the fourth was a composite of gold, silver, and iron, which was presented to P.K. Stafford, who was soon to be appointed the governor of Arizona Territory. So there were 4 spikes. The focus is usually on the one, of course. Next picture, please, John. Now, this is another photograph of that ceremony. And I think it's interesting because it's possibly taken just before they tapped in the spikes. And you could actually see a tie, very pronounced, lying in front of Governor Stanford on the right with a hammer on his shoulder. And next to a Mrs. Mary Ryan, fine Irish lady, in a white dress. The Central Pacific Railroad Chief Engineer J.H. Strobridge is there holding a shovel with Mrs. Strobridge to his left. The archive notes say these 2 ladies are the only white women at the ceremony. I wonder who the other women were. Looks like a young girl there too, you can see. It may be one of the few photos that really isolate and show the original laurel tie harvested from our tree. The formal comments by dignitaries were unimpressive compared to the dynamic tuning display of the Central Pacific wood-burning locomotive Jupiter and the Union Pacific coal-burning number 119, driving over the ceremonial tie and spikes before they were removed for safekeeping. There are also hilarious contradictory recounts of the crowd whittling several ties for souvenir splinters. A large sprue of gold had been attached to the gold spike, which was removed to make dandy finger rings for the dignitaries. Both the laurel tie and gold spike had been exhibited in San Francisco and Sacramento before and after the railroad completion ceremony. There are conflicting accounts and speculations of where the laurel tie was being exhibited when it was destroyed by the 1906 SF quake and fire. 2 possible locations are the Flood Building at 870 Market Street and the Merchants Exchange Building on the south side of California Street, downtown San Francisco off Montgomery. Next picture, please, John. Excuse me. I'm very pleased to have this picture with the permission of Gordon Chang, the author of Ghosts of Gold Mountain, which is a book that was just published for the 150th anniversary here. And he's the professor at Stanford who is one of the leaders of this wonderful renaissance of Chinese Americans rediscovering their history and teaching us what we really should know and are very eager to know. The names of most Chinese workers were not recorded. This toxic erasure of human endeavor cries for recovery of family history. Now, these three men here, who contributed nobly in 1869, were recognized at the 50th anniversary on the sidelines, not as part of the ceremony. The ceremony, year after year, only 148 years, it would be the big four and the financiers and the capitalists in the reenactment, and the Chinese were excluded. Well, the workers in general were excluded. Three venerable railroad Chinese who installed the final rail tie of the Transcontinental Railroad, shown here at the 1919 50th anniversary at Promontory Point while in their 90s. The overriding reality of political awareness among Chinese in the U.S. is derivative of the extreme prejudice against Chinese that unfolded during the economic strife following the waning of the gold mining and railroad jobs, culminating in the 1870s and 80s with the deplorable 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was still in effect when these gentlemen had their picture taken. The Chinese Exclusion Act continued until 1945 when it became our advantage to have China as an ally. The working class competition between Chinese and Irish, which was greatly fomented by a sandlot labor demagogue, Dennis Carney, in San Francisco, needs to be acknowledged and understood. History is always still in the making. History was misrepresented again at the 100th Gold Spike anniversary in 1969, getting into at least my era. Some of you kids here know, but quite a few are with me on this. The respected Chinese American Philip Choi of the Chinese Historical Society of America in San Francisco was invited via telegraph to attend and speak at the 100th Gold Spike. Yet when Phil arrived, he was bumped so that another could speak. Believe it or not, the favorite speaker was John Wayne. Yeah, very representative of building the railroad and winning the war in the West. Further xenophobia was exhibited in 1969 by keynote speaker John Volpe, U.S. Secretary of the Interior, who bragged, "Who else but Americans could drill tunnels in the mountains 30 feet deep in snow?" Of course, the Chinese who did it were not allowed to be citizens, and he wasn't going to mention them, was he? This infamous statement was unforgettably witnessed by our friend Carl Nolte of the San Francisco Chronicle. Then is when I came along in 2017. On March 25th, 2017, Mill Valley's Hillary Flynn, who lives not far from here, and Margaret McPeak, both of Irish American Crossroads Festival, staged a groundbreaking event at the United Irish Cultural Center way out by the zoo in San Francisco, which is where many of the Chinese and many of the Irish live, by the way, which brought together a packed house of Chinese and Irish intrigued by the topic Chinese and Irish workers in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. After the riveting presentation by Professors Gordon Chang, Stanford, and Barry McCarran, New York University, independent scholar and activist Lotus Fong invited Patrick Goggins of the Irish Literary Historical Society to accompany a contingent of 25 Chinese Americans to attend the 148th anniversary of the completion of the railroad at the Golden Spike in Utah. And so Uta and I boarded the Zephyr in Emeryville and rode coach. We didn't want to isolate ourselves. We wanted to bond. And we rode coach for 19 hours with 25 Chinese Americans, and it was a blast. So at that 148th Gold Spike anniversary, we observed the annual reenactment of the original Gold Spike ceremony, including Leland Stanford and officialdom, with no Chinese workers included. We heard a token Chinese person speak about what it meant to him. He just could have been anyone off the street, say, well, it means to me a story of hard work to accomplish this great feat. We were immediately told by the Chinese attendees in our midst that the guest speaker was from Taiwan, not Canton, and that would be like having someone from Alaska talking about Florida. The Cantonese descendants felt betrayed again. Later, we learned that the state of Utah does not recognize the People's Republic of China. There's quite a political story behind that for another time. Incidentally, we saw a plaque on a boulder there. It was pointed out to us by Lotus Fong, who can't be with us tonight. We'll mention that more later. And it had on it a plaque for the Irish workers. To the Irish who toiled on the Transcontinental Railroad, dedicated May 10th and March 17, 1996, Hibernia Society of Utah. My question is, why does the Promontory Point National Park, it's now a national park, honor the Irish and not the Chinese, not the Mormons, not the African Americans, and all the others who worked on the railroad? So I'll get that answer in due time. At the 148th Gold Spike anniversary, the last tie was incidentally referenced in the ceremony, but no mention was made of it being from a laurel tree or from Mount Tam in Marin County. Now, the next picture, John, please. Thank you. So now you're at the 150th. The 150th anniversary of the completion. In between that 148th and even starting a year before that and the May 10th is when the scholars started to write the books about we want our place in history. All over the country, you had publications coming out about it. And you had an organization started in Utah by Judge Michael Kwan, the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendants Association. You're looking at the only non-Chinese member. And he and all of the activist, community-oriented Chinese across the country focused on being able to compel the organizers of the 150th ceremony to recognize the Chinese and all the others who worked on it. And it worked because you can see there 20,000 people came, and they're all looking and waiting for the two locomotives to come, which is a grand sight because one appears on the horizon over there, and you see the puff of white smoke coming from the steam, and then the other one appears coming from the other direction, and you see the coal black smoke coming out, and then they start to toot and they start to whistle, and they come up and do a dance together at the conclusion. But everyone is there waiting for this, and it was a transformative, scholarly, attention and community activist lobbying that created, this time, a cultural and social force compelling the manifest inclusive nature of the 150th Gold Strike. And it was in the spirit of collaboration. They had a native ceremony, Native American, a lion dance, railroad worker skits showing the Chinese working, the Irish, the African Americans, the Mormons. I'm not sure the Italians were included, but they should have been because they had considerable numbers as well. Next picture, John. So this picture merely illustrates the spirit, the genuine festive spirit that everyone had because of this collaborative effort that manifests itself with inclusiveness. I don't know those two ladies, but maybe Norman might. Okay. Norman was among the 20,000 with us. Next picture, John. Now this picture again shows the fun and the sense of accomplishment. So the gentleman who's looking right at you and us and me is Leland Wong. So when I went with Uta in 2017 and they took us all to the dim sum restaurant, 70 of us forming the membership of the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendants Association, someone gave me a tip and they said, Pat, when you meet Leland Wong, watch your step because he's kind of skeptical about Irish. And so anyway, he introduced me to Leland Wong. I put my hand out when they said, Patrick Goggins, this is Leland Wong. And this is what Leland Wong did. Drink, fight, drink, and walked right out of the room. I liked him and knew right then that we would become friends. Leland is a hero in the Chinese community because he has done flash dance on the side activities at these reenactments over the years. And the last time we saw him, Uta and I went to a wonderful celebration at the Chinese Railroad Museum in Sacramento, where they were unveiling a statue of Chinese workers. And at the front, as you walk in by the locomotives, they had a suckling pig, a great big one there in a big tub, and you have giant toothpicks to sample it and have your drinks and then walk into your tables. And so we all did that. We went to our table, and then Uta and I were sitting at the table of Fiona Ma, the state treasurer, and then Leland came over to join us. So he came over, and instead of coming and sitting by me, he sat down, just one from Uta, and he had brought a guest. Then he got up and came over and looked at me and said, "Let's have a taste of wine." And we had our taste of wine, and the guest that he brought was the huge head of the pig from the display. There it was, sitting there right next to Uta during the entire event. So you could get an idea that Leland Wong is one heck of a character and very much appreciated heart and soul. So now the next picture here, of course, has another firecracker from the Chinese community, our good friend Norman Ten, a partner in worthy causes. And Norman had the gold spike prop there and took me over, and we had a picture taken in front of the locomotives. And Norman and I are pursuing various avenues to get recognition and reconciliation and understanding. And so it's pleasing to announce that we are going to be co-captains of a new unit in the San Francisco St. Patrick's Day Parade, Saturday, March 14th in the city, co-sponsored by the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, of which Norman is president in San Francisco, and the Irish Literary and Historical Society, which I am the chair of the board. So that's really, Norman is bringing his group from the Chinese New Year's parade, where they won first prize. So we're going to have those people in the parade with us there, and it'll be great. Norman will say a few words here in a few minutes when I'm concluding. Next picture, please, John. So this photograph is centered on the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendants Association people I mentioned, who came in a group. We were living in hotels together and had an 8-day conference that focused in on very specific things relating to the railroad, such as the Chinese arches, where they had ceremonies near the completion, and how they would trace records back on the payment bills and so forth. And this was orchestrated, and this picture was taken by Corky Lee, who is a famed Chinese-American photographer. If you look in the front there, I won't use the pointer because I think you can see that yellow wreath there, and right behind it is Judge Michael Kwan, the founder of the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendants Association, and next to him, to his left in the orange, it was Margaret Yi, the Grand Dame of the Chinese community in Utah. So this was, you could see, a satisfying event to be able to come and have representation at the ceremony, where John Meacham gave a great talk recognizing all of the workers as the keynote speaker. Now, next picture, John. This picture is on the other side of the tracks. You weren't allowed to go over there with the 20,000 people facing the grandstand. This is behind the grandstand and behind the locomotives. So Amy, our daughter, who's here with me now, with us now, and I received permission to briefly cross the tracks and snap a photo of the Laurel Tie Replica, which a fellow who polishes and keeps clean the locomotives told me, "Oh, I know, there's a tie over there. Just go take a look. There is a replica of the tie." Nobody else had ever mentioned it, nothing in the, whatever. So we went over there, and there it was. And it had no upright sign marking this unique relic. It's an important photo because it's where the crowd was not allowed to go and is not, highlighted. The National Park Rangers standing guard at the tracks, keeping people from coming over, and a couple of the reenactors you can see right there. And it's something that we're learning more about, how that came about. Next picture, please. So there's a close-up of it. You can note the beauty of the laurel wood, and you see 2 of the 4 holes that were pre-drilled for the ceremonial spikes. And you see just the square of the silver plate. Well, where are we now that we discovered that? We are now aware that there is a replica of the Laurel Tie at Promontory Point in Utah, and that the Laurel Tie is mentioned in some brochures at the Utah State Capitol building in Salt Lake City, yet there is no replica of the Laurel Tie in the San Francisco Bay Area where the tie originated, nor is it popularly listed in any brochures available within the Golden Gate National Seashore, Mount Tamalpais State Park, any historical society that I know of, or at any municipality in Marin. You could find it deep into the library. In some of the books, I put a few of them over here that are good resource books. At the same time, the original gold spike is grandly displayed at Stanford University and described voluminously in many libraries, shops, and bookstores. We also understand that the gold spike has been and is connected to the capitalist financiers of the First Transcontinental Railroad. We realize that primarily by inference, the Laurel Tie has been linked by workers to the workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad, because it relates to something that they did. They brought all of the ties to the tracks. They brought the rails. They did the grading. They did all of the heavy, duty work. Therefore, it is incumbent upon those who care about the truthful historical representation to accept the challenge and take the opportunity we have to remedy the unfortunate forgetting of the Laurel Tie. Next picture, please. There you are. So that, just quickly, that's the silver plate. And it does list Leland Stanford and Huntington and Charles Crocker and Mark Hopkins. And it says that it was presented by West Evans to the group. And that's one of the reasons why I want you to remember the name of Hughes. Because Hughes, as I say, he paid for it. It was his idea. But he didn't need to grandstand and be there to present it. So history recorded that West Evans, the man who he asked and hired to go ahead and have the Laurel Tie made by the billiard maker, was there to take, the stand with the dignitaries. Now, if the plate does not mention workers, and if you go to the next picture, please, now. Here we are. Our community can recreate the Laurel Tie honoring the workers, because the idea of the Laurel Tie is the noble carrying of a message of honor to those who have accomplished something worthy. It behooves us to make a reincarnation. If a replica is made, complete with details, including the silver plate, then an additional and more inclusive plaque, specifically honoring the workers, would certainly be in order. As with all historic revivals, an appropriate place for display needs discussion. And in this case, already, the Gravity Barn on Mount Tam has been identified as a sound location choice for such a replica. It gives uplifting pleasure to call out for local historians to enjoin community action to create recognition of the Laurel ethos with the Laurel Tie. Next picture. Now, this is interesting for me. I don't know if Jack Gallagher is here. Is Jack Gallagher here? Jack, thank you. And when I was sitting there at the watershed with Uta having a beer, Jack pointed out to me that this laurel tree is one of the largest and oldest laurel trees in Marin County. So there it is, so noble, right there in downtown Mill Valley. Thank you, Jack, for pointing that out at the Watershed Cafe. Next picture, John. This picture is of a historic sign in the Lucretia Little History Room upstairs, Mill Valley Library. Matt Circle, senior park ranger on Mount Tam, heard that the Laurel Tie may have been cut from a tree at Laurel Dell, because we're looking for that information as well. Well, thanks to Jack Gibson and Matt for alerting us regarding the Laurel Dell possibility. Maybe Tamalpais, Mount Tamalpais State Park could make an interpretive sign telling the story of the forgotten Laurel Tie of the forgotten workers, and Laurel Dell might be an appropriate place for that. Next picture. I'm just about ready for Norman to come up. This photograph, God bless, is of Congressman Pete McCloskey and Lotus. And before I received a phone call this morning, my intention was to point out a good example of two people who are advocates for restoring the Chinese workers to their proper places in the history of the railroad and in general. Congressman Pete McCloskey's family owns property with Chinese artifacts from the 2,000 to 3,000 people who lived in Dutch Flat during the building of the railroad, and they, want to preserve. And Lotus was working with Pete McCloskey and myself on that. And Pete died, I was just told this morning. I don't know any details, but his story is, I'll just mention, his story is something. This is one of the books he wrote a year in the Marine Rifle Company, Korea, 1950-51. I think most of you know that he was a valiant soldier and then a Republican congressman, Republican Party. And when the Vietnam War came, he objected and really became an advocate for peace, and in fact joined the Democratic Party and became a great humanitarian in the process. So after a minute, when Norman comes up, we thought we'd have a moment of silence for Pete, and perhaps a moment of silence for the Chinese railroad workers too. Next to last picture, John, thanks. This is a wonderful example of someone taking the lead and recognizing the significance of the Laurel Tie, being brought back into our consciousness and our history books. It's from the President, Catherine Sears of the Marin County Board of Supervisors, and it's a wonderful congratulatory letter. I was almost thinking of printing them all up for you to see the language there. Maureen Parton, who is here, is an aide to the Board of Supervisors, and she was a principal in making this happen, so that we had a letter, a commendatory letter, congratulatory, from the Marin Board to the Chinese, banquet there of the railroad workers, and to the Gold Spike Foundation, and even to the Hibernian Society with the Irish. So I want to thank Catherine and Maureen and the board for showing the way. I will get copies of this for any of you that would like to see it. The letter was read and delivered at the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendants Association Gala Dinner. Thank you. Here's the last one, right, John? All right. Okay. This is a little different here. I've talked, and I didn't mention Native Americans because they're frequently forgotten. The impact on Native American society was, huge. As you know, it changed their way of life of those in the middle of the country. And so the bent spike, throughout history, technologically advanced humans have encroached on indigenous peoples, changing their ways of life. The First Transcontinental Railroad in the U.S. was the principal tool and weapon overwhelming the natives. I offer this bent railroad spike as my tribute to the resilience of American Indians. The spike symbolizes the power of Joe Stiffarm of the Gros Ventre and Assiniboine tribes at Fort Belknap Reservation. Joe was a section gang chief of the Great Northern and Burlington Northern Railway, whose team set the spike driving track laying record in Montana. Here's to Joe. Here's a straight one. When you find these on the side of the tracks, they're frequently because they were bent when they pulled them out. Now they have machines that pull them out and they still bend them. But some of them are a result of, John Henry type strikes. And that's Joe Stiffarm. He didn't get the name because he became the famous spiker. His father was named Joe Stiffarm before he got on the railroad. All right. Thank you very much. I'd like Norman to come up and say a few words. Norman 10.
Okay, good evening. Can you hear me? Okay. I actually like to say thank you to everyone here for your interest, and I especially want to thank this gentleman. Patrick and I, we got to know each other back in 2018 in the summer, right? And I went to his house. It's a beautiful house. And with that, things started happening. I spent 27 years of my life at the Exploratorium as a life sciences senior tech. In fact, Catherine Shaw, I worked with her, and she's from Mill Valley. And Larry, I loved him to death, okay, her husband. And so with that, what I just want to tell you is there were a lot of creative juices happening down in his, where were we? Down on the bottom, what do you call that room? Your catacomb, yes. It really was. It really was. And so I'm a third generation native San Franciscan. My mom, my grandmother were born in San Francisco. My grandfather, on the other hand, on my dad's side, was born in the Mojave Desert, of all places. And I was researching, and I was asking my aunt, I think I got it. There was a railroad being built from Los Angeles to Arizona, Phoenix, right? She says, yes, there was. But your grandfather, no. The great-grandparents, no. They were actually working for the Borax Mining Company, and they actually had the better jobs. They were not the miners, but they were the cooks. So, yeah, you lucked out. You didn't have to breathe all that stuff. But it got down to what we were discussing. How do we educate the public? How do we actually correct history? But more importantly, how do we recognize people of the past of what they've actually done for this entire country? And so hence the idea came, I really love the idea about the Chinese New Year's parade because it happens around, early part of the year. The 150th anniversary happens in May. And so thus the idea was born. We were going to go ahead, my group, the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, which is the first and only recognized labor group for APIs. API stands for Asian Pacific Islanders. We decided, you know what? Let's do it. Now, what was the challenge? I'll tell you the challenge. We are a labor group. The Chinese New Year's parade, which is coming up on this coming Saturday, is a Chamber of Commerce parade. You got it? So, unbelievable. They accepted our proposal, and trust me, there are so many hoops to go through before you even get the okay. One hoop was, submit your $300 registration for the parade, and by the way, it's non-refundable, and it's also, I just say, if you don't get accepted, it's still non-refundable. Okay, and so those are little hoops. So then I get asked, so your group, are you guys fundraising for the float? It's about $20,000, $30,000 for a float in a parade. And I looked at the person, I was going, what float? Because if I recall correctly, the Chinese railroad workers and other immigrants that worked on the railroad, okay, they didn't have a float or a train. They actually walked to work every day from their tent. So right now, I just want everybody to close their eyes really quickly, okay? Imagine being a family member and hearing that your husband or your son is leaving to a foreign country and leaving you behind. How does that feel? Your loved ones leaving to go to some mysterious place Why? To make sure they got money to send back to you so you could eat, so that you could survive. Imagine being the person going off to this foreign land, but you're excited because there's a possibility of striking it rich at Gold Mountain, where you hear stories. You just walk and if you trip, oh my goodness, there's gold here. Right. And then when you get there, the language is totally different. You're relying on others. And then when you get up to the mountains, what's that white stuff? They've never seen white stuff before. And the reason why is, as Patrick had mentioned, they came from southern China. They came from predominantly fishing villages and also from farms. Imagine being in a tropical area. What's this white stuff? Were they prepared? No. But trust me, they had to adapt. They did whatever they could. Now, you heard about also the food that they brought over. That was a contract. And so they went for preserved fish, preserved veggies. Has anyone ever tried any of that? Okay, some people have, and most of you haven't. Try it. Okay? Now, here's the thing. I'll change that to burgers, okay? Can you imagine eating the same burger every day? Can you imagine eating burgers 3 times a day? Oh, my goodness. So you can imagine what one of those railroad workers were thinking. Mom's cooking. Fresh vegetables. And then on a special day, dim sum. But when we were out there in Utah, that land was flat. It was cold. You could see the mountains way yonder, snow-capped. Nowhere to go. You gonna quit? Sure. Go walk. Now, here's another one. Imagine, and guys, anybody who used to run track, cross country, jog, okay, just imagine. We have fuse lighters. They're it's a specialty. Oh, sir, you look fantastic. Woo! You're in shape. Guess what? You know, we like to give you an opportunity to make a little extra money. We're looking for people like you. Fuse lighters. So what that was, okay, it was not lighting dynamite. In fact, dynamite was too expensive. What you do is you drill a hole, okay, and you fill it up with black powder, stick in the fuse, light it, and start doing that, right? Start running. Guess what? Great. Now, what happens? The tunnel gets deeper and deeper, right? You're doing good, right? Here's the problem. You're doing granite. It's hard. You can't say granite is hard as rock because it's hard. It is rock. But what I'm just saying is the tunnel's getting deeper and deeper, okay? You're doing good, sir. You are doing fantastic. But here's the thing. The company is still using the same length of fuse and giving it to you. So if you had 10 yards, okay, or 10 meters of fuse, great. First 5 meters, no problem, right? 10 meters, no problem. Except that now the tunnel is 100 meters. Good luck. Right? Yeah. Okay. So we think about the workers because they built the railroad. And so we need to remember them. And that's where I get so excited working with this gentleman. The laurel tie, the last tie, the symbol for labor, the symbol of the people of Mill Valley, California. Right? And you guys should all know the theme song. Mill Valley, that's where my... Yeah. You can tell I'm a San Franciscan. I know that. So with that, I know there's others, so I just like to ask for a moment of silence just to remember all the workers. Yes, there were about 1,200 Chinese workers that never got home, but we also know there are other workers that are unsung and they're injured, and also the people they left behind. Thank you.
In conclusion, I quote Gordon Chang from The Ghost of the Gold Mountain. As many as 1,200 lost their lives. Those who survived would suffer a different kind of death, a historical one, as they were pushed first to the margins of American life and then to the fringes of public memory. I want to thank everybody, and I want to particularly thank Dick Spotswood, because when Ut and I came back and started telling people, gee, we learned that there was a laurel tie that came from Mount Tam. I talked with dozens and dozens and dozens of people. One person knew about it, and that was Dick Spotswood. He's our columnist, our historian, and of course a railroad buff, and he was back there for the 150th himself. Not only was he aware of it, but he was the first person that pointed me to the possibility that it had been destroyed in the 1906 fire and earthquake. So I'd like to thank the people at the Lucretia Library History Center, and Kate Mayfield, who used to be here, helped me in the research, and there's other people in the city with the History Room and the Historical Society. But right now, it's time to turn it over to Deborah, and thank Deborah and Abby Wasserman for making this happen.
Thanks, Pat. You can come up here, Fred. Before I hand it over to Fred, I just want to say I hope I see you next month. We have a wonderful panel discussion with land preservationists Huey Johnson, Marty Griffin, Doug Ferguson, and Bob Pretzel, and the topic of panel discussion will be Rebels with the Cause, Revisiting Marincello. Fred, will you close the evening?
That's a hard act to follow. Norman, Pat, thank you very much. Deborah, thank you also. My name's Fred Runner. I'm a train nut, just put it lightly. And I'm the president of a nonprofit that is working to restore a thing called Engine Number 9. For those of you who might not know about it, this is what Number 9 looked like 100 years ago, 99 years ago. Number 9 was the last locomotive ever built to run on Mount Tamalpais. It is the only one that still survives. We actually won it in an auction 2 years ago. The town of Scotia, where it had been for 65 years, put it up for auction, and we got lucky. Only cost us $54,000. Anyway, it's a symbol of the railroad construction up Mount Tamalpais and the days when Mill Valley was put on the map by a scenic railway that competed with things like Pikes Peak and the Zermatt Railway up to the Matterhorn. Anyway, it was brutally scrapped in 1930. Number 9 managed to avoid being scrapped, and we're working on restoring it. And in fact, tomorrow morning, we'll begin the restoration process by undoing the universal joints underneath the fire pan so we can remove asbestos and other hazardous materials as the beginning step of restoring Number 9. Deborah was kind enough, and so was Pat and Norman, to let you know that we're working on restoring Number 9, and of course that's all going to take money, and we have a little fundraiser in May to raise money for restoring Number 9, and I just wanted to hand these out tonight. If anybody would like one, we'd love to give you one. We're looking for sponsors for the fundraising event. It's May 24th. In fact, it's an event where we're partnering with the Mill Valley Historical Society. That day will be their annual Walk into History, which will be themed about the railroad. The base of operations will be the Outdoor Art Club. All that happens in the morning as they walk to the depot and up Blythedale Canyon and talk about the railroad days and point out the important landmarks. That night at the Outdoor Art Club, we'll do our little fundraiser, trying to raise thousands of dollars so we can continue to restore the locomotive. It's going to take us about $250,000 to do that, and that's just the beginning. So it's an ambitious project, and we know it's going to take a little while to get it going. This is what number 9 looks like today, sitting on a private ranch in Sonoma County, away, off the beaten path, so to speak. But it's a place where we can work on it and not have to worry about people trying to steal things from it or anything like that. So that's the goal, is to take this and return it to this, what it looked like in 1921, with gold leaf lettering on the side, 5-inch high letters, white wall tires, and other swanky things that steam engines had. So I'd love to give you a little save the date flyer. I'll put those by Pat's books on the door so you can take one, and hopefully we'll see you in May. Thank you very much, Deborah.
Thank you so much. I don't think we really have time for Q&A right now, but perhaps you can just talk with Pat directly if you have any questions about the presentation. Thank you all for coming here this evening. Have a safe drive home.